I'm here today because I'm concerned that our country has been headed in the wrong direction for some time. I'm not talking about the current president or the guy before that. I'm talking multiple decades here. I'm further concerned that if we don't begin shifting the ship in a different direction, that none of us is going to like the outcome. Over the course of the presentation, I'm going to share with you my thoughts on where we are socially, where we are financially as a country. I'm afraid something has gone amiss. And then I'm going to offer you what I ultimately believe to be the solution. Now, during the course of the presentation, I'm going to delve into some areas that we've become a bit uncomfortable with in our country today. I'm going to talk about government. I'm going to talk about entitlements. But I'll promise you this presentation isn't about red or blue states. It's not about liberals or conservatives. This presentation is about you and me. So if you feel yourself getting a little uncomfortable, hang in with me. Let's see where we end up together. You know, the neat thing about being an American is there are multiple instances over our country's history where Americans have overcome tremendous adversity. I think about the World War II generation, a group of men and women who were willing to put the needs of others before themselves, a group of men and women who were willing to sacrifice for the greater good. And as a result of their collective efforts, they overcame the most evil dictator our generations have known. And with their victory, the war ended. And I don't think it was an event, more so a long, slow process, but our country's culture has shifted away from those ideals that led to that victory into something completely different. A culture focused exclusively on me, on take. And we've seen the impact of that cultural shift exhibit itself in many different ways over the decades. We saw it with the emergence of the drug culture during the course of the 1960s. We see it in the ugliness that is drug abuse in our country today. I have the opportunity on occasion to work with the prison ministry. We counsel gentlemen who are going to be getting out of jail relatively soon. Most of them are in prison for drug-related offenses. And it's always interesting when you ask them, who were you trying to make feel better when you took that hit? Without hesitation, they point to themselves. We saw it exhibit itself a bit differently during the course of the 1980s, a time when in many parts of the country the economy got very good. We saw the emergence of the yuppie generation, a group of men and women that got very good at taking the best for themselves. And then one of the ugliest ways we see it in culture today is with men failing to take responsibility for their families. Now, you could undoubtedly add 10 or 20 additional social ills that have come with this shift in culture. I want to focus more of our time talking about the financial impact of the decisions we make. And I'm going to start here with some macro level information on our economy. There are several themes I'd like you to pick up on this particular slide. The first thing I'll draw your attention to is we're looking at the period of 1965 to present day, 45 to 50 years. Now, this blue line on the bottom here represents the percentage increase in GDP, gross domestic product, what we produce as a country, over the course of that time period. Our GDP increases at an annualized rate of about 2.7% over that time period. Now, looking at this red line that's on a bit of a different trajectory, that represents the percentage increase of entitlement expenses over the course of the same time period. Now, I'll define entitlement expenses for you in just a bit, but you'll notice that entitlement expenses have increased to the tune of 10.6% over the course of the same time period. Now, those of you who are very disappointed with our current president may be camped out in a place where you think that things would have been a lot different had the other guy been elected. I'm going to challenge you not to stay camped out there very long, because I'll remind you that we're looking at a period of 45 years. Now, we have had Republican and Democrat presidents. We've had Republican and Democrat Congresses over the course of that time period. It doesn't seem to matter who's in charge. The promises to the American people outstrip our ability to produce them. Kind of sort of reminds me of the ancient saying that the most effective way to control people is to make them reliant upon you. Now, I'm no conspiracy theorist, so I don't think a group of men got together in a room in 1965 and planned it out this way. But it's hard not to conclude when you look at the data, when you look at the community, that this is not precisely what's happening in our country today. And how do you think we've funded all of the promises? We've borrowed the money to the tune of over $17 trillion today. Fact is, we put people like Bernie Madoff in jail for running the type of system that we're running in our country. We're essentially stealing from the future to fund the things that we want today. Let's talk more deeply about entitlement expenses for just a moment. I'm going to define entitlement expenses the way that the media traditionally defines them, namely Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. A couple of caveats before we dig into that is that's not the only reason. These two programs are not the only reason that our country's in the financial position it's in today. Others would point out corporate bailouts, flood insurance subsidies. Some may even say we spend too much money on defense. There are multiple reasons why our financial picture is what it is. But I'm going to focus on those two programs because first of all, they're large, and I'll give you some perspective for that in just a moment. But second of all is most Americans are relatively familiar with how those systems work. So we're going to talk about some things that we understand. I am not fundamentally opposed to either of these programs. In fact, I think they were designed by people with their hearts in the right place. But something has gone terribly wrong. Let's talk about Social Security. Social Security consumes 20% of our national expenditures. Clearly a program that was designed with the best of intentions. We wanted to make sure that men and women who worked all of their lives, who put into the program, had a roof over their head and food to eat upon their retirement. But something's gone wrong. The design of the Social Security program could not have predicted three very important factors that have placed the program in jeopardy today. First of all, they could not have predicted the baby boom generation. And we're just now getting to the time when the number of people exiting the workforce exceeds the number of people entering the workforce. This is no one's fault. The math just doesn't work as well anymore. Second of all is they could not have predicted that we'd start living to 90 years old. When the program was designed, you may have worked to 62, you died when you were 65. You weren't drawing benefits from the program for very long. Now, thankfully, due to advances in medical care, we are living a lot longer than we used to, essentially drawing money from the system longer than was planned. Again, no one's fault. It's just the fact of life that we're going to have to deal with. And then lastly, and unfortunately, which speaks so directly to the shift in culture that I alluded to earlier, is the designers of the Social Security program could not have predicted that there would be a day when Americans would seek attorneys to have themselves declared incapable. Wall Street Journal ran an article recently, 5.3% of working-age Americans are now on Social Security disability. 5.3%, that's more than 1 in 20, and the number is growing. The same article noted that if the disability side of the program does not start borrowing from the retirement side of the program, it's going to be bankrupt by 2016. We're no longer talking about things that are going to happen in 10 or 20 years. This stuff's on our doorstep today. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about Medicare and Medicaid. Those two programs account for 21% of our national expenditures. Again, a program that was designed with the very best of intentions. Under Medicare, we wanted to make sure that senior citizens have access to the health care they need when they need it most. And there's not a person in this room that wants to see a poor child go without the medication that they need. But something has gone wrong. I have the opportunity to serve on the board of one of the hospitals here in town, and when I was introduced to the industry, the data was absolutely staggering to me. It is not unusual for more than 60, 70, 80% of a hospital's revenues to be derived from government sources. And I'm talking pre-Obamacare statistics here. And what do you think happens when you insert a middleman between a transaction? In this case, patient and provider. We know what happens. Price goes up. What do you think happens when that middleman is the federal government? Prices absolutely explode. And we're left with a program that, despite the fact that it was designed with the best of intentions, is so racked with fraud and abuse, it's essentially exceeded our human ability to manage it very effectively. And then I'm going to throw one additional item into the definition today. I'm going to talk about unemployment expense. Unemployment insurance has gone up to 16% of our national budget. Those three programs combined now account for 57% of our expenditures. It would be mighty easy for me to stand before you today and blame those guys in D.C. for doing this to us. But I think it's time we all took some personal responsibility, because you see, all of this happened on our watch. And if nothing else, you and I have been guilty of complacency. And I examined why on earth we would let something like this happen. I think it comes down to this simple concept, is by doing this, we've allowed ourselves to keep our hands clean. I think back to Hurricane Katrina just a few years back, sitting on my couch in my living room, watching reports from the Superdome that people were hungry and thirsty. And not one time did the thought cross my mind to load my car with water and head 2.5 hours down the interstate to help those people. I waited for the helicopters to roll in. When the guy down the street loses his job, we no longer knock on the door and say, "Hey man, how can I help you?" We assume someone else has got it covered. We have essentially outsourced caring for our family, our friends, and our neighbors to the federal government, and there is an incredible price to pay for that. And speaking of paying the price, the vast majority of national revenues are derived from individual income taxes and Social Security taxes. Those two programs account for 81% of our national revenues. A lot of folks like to point to this small sliver of pie in the upper left-hand corner here. That's corporate income taxes. Corporate income taxes make up only 9% of our national revenues. You can stand before large groups of people to thunderous applause by demanding that we have to tax those fat cat companies more than we do today. But there's a fallacy in that argument, you see. Because companies don't really pay taxes, do they? What do? They pass them on. Citizens pay taxes. So for every loophole of Exxon's that you and I choose to close, understand this, it is going to cost you more when you fill up your tank. We have built a mighty big mess for ourselves. And before I shift away from this particular slide, I wanted to give you some perspective here. These pie charts are to scale. In essence, the expenditure pie chart is a heck of a lot bigger than the revenue pie chart, hence all the debt. And you and I know that as individuals, you can't live this way for very long, or your bank is going to shut you down. Now, just because governments are allowed to do it for longer periods of time doesn't make it any more sustainable. Something is going to have to give. And what I'm going to suggest is going to have to give is our collective lifestyle. And speaking of lifestyle, no discussion of the American economy would be complete without talking about consumer behavior. We really like our stuff in this country. In fact, leading up to the Great Recession, the national savings rate reached near zero. We were spending as much money as we had. Is it any wonder that we would allow our government to do the same thing? And then the headlines hit about the Great Recession, and we got smart for a little while. You see the savings rate increasing for a relatively short period of time. But our thirst for things has gotten the very best of us once those headlines disappear. And the savings rate is just about as low as it's ever been. You know, when me is the focus, when take is the focus, you get the mess that we're in today. And I don't care if you're black or white, male or female, conservative or liberal, we're in this together. And we've got a key decision to make. We can keep doing things the way that we're doing them today. And I promise you we will go off the cliff together. Now, I can't tell you exactly when that happens. I can't tell you exactly what it looks like. But I promise you this much. It's not going to be nearly as subtle as you and I would like it to be. I'm going to suggest today that we pursue option number 2 and lead the change that we hope to see in this country. And if you and I are going to lead the change, the first thing we're going to have to do is reject what has gotten us here today. What's Einstein's definition of insanity? Repeating the same things and expecting a different outcome. If you and I want to lead this country to a better place, we're going to have to be willing to change personally. And here's where I'm going to suggest we start. As I look around the room, as I think of my own life, you and I have been very successful as it comes to defining success the American way these days. I think back when I was a little boy, 11 or 12 years old, my mom sitting me down and saying, "Son, you're going to have a better life than we had." And let me tell you, my mom is not a materialistic person to this day. She didn't teach that in her home. But when she said better, I thought more. More money, a bigger house, a faster car, grander vacations, you name it. And collectively, that's where our psyche has been for quite a while in this country. And interestingly enough, as we've gained more stuff, as our country has become the wealthiest country in the history of the world, that's not happiness on the x-axis. It's antidepressant usage. I have the opportunity in my current job and in past jobs to see how companies spend their prescription drug dollars, and we are popping these pills like candy. It's a problem across the country, in Louisiana, in our town. And you know, if the stats are right, it's a problem in this room. How can it be that with so much stuff, we're so collectively miserable? I'm going to suggest it's because we've been pursuing all of these things. And as we've filled our lives with these things, we have grown farther and farther apart from one another, essentially robbing our hearts of what it is that we desire most. So I'm ready to talk solutions. How are you and I going to go about leading this country to a better place? The first thing we've got to decide is that fear does not rule the day. I'm tired of being scared. And I know I've provided you with some pretty scary financial data today that doesn't help the situation much. But you know, none of the data that I've shown you today is nearly as scary as Hitler taking over another country in Europe. But Americans of that day eventually pulled their heads out of the sand. Now, it may have taken Pearl Harbor for them, but they eventually pulled their heads out of the sand, and they went to the factories and they made bombs. They laced up their boots and they marched on Normandy. Now, fortunately, you and I don't have to do those types of things, but it is our time to step up. And yes, the problems that we face are absolutely massive. I wish I could tell you how to get all these people off of drugs. I don't know how to do that. I further wish that as a bank CFO, I could tell you how to unwind all of this debt. I'm afraid the problem is bigger than me, but we can remain paralyzed no more. It's time for you and I to focus on controlling what it is that we do control. And I control these, I control my feet, and I control right here. And if you and I will become committed to controlling what it is that we do control, we can have a tremendous impact. And as we go about taking control, I think it's very important that we each take a step back for just a moment. Get a sense for how deeply our culture has impacted you. Here's a real simple test to tell you where your heart lies. And for those of you with kids, your kids count as you for purposes of answering this question. Where do you spend your time and money? When I took this test, it became very clear to me that if I was going to be part of leading this country to a better place, I was going to have to make some personal changes in my life. And once we've taken the inventory and we're ready to move forward, it's time for us to stop complaining and start acting. How much time have you wasted at the water cooler complaining about all the things that are wrong in this country? I have wasted far too much time. Heck, we have 10 quasi-news agencies on my cable dial that are devoted exclusively to pointing out the problems and pointing the finger, and nothing gets solved. And here it is, my rocket science solution for leading our country to a better place is you and I have to actively seek opportunities to serve people that can do absolutely nothing for us. And you go, wait a second, can it be this easy? I think you know that this conceptually, only the concept is easy here. Actually delivering upon this is tremendously difficult. But in a culture built on take, here's the antidote. 3 amazing things happen when you and I are willing to serve. First of all, somebody that needs help gets help. And there are plenty of people in our community, plenty of people across the country that just need a helping hand. And second of all, each of you is far more influential than you believe yourself to be. When you're willing to set out and set the example, people are watching and they'll follow. What do you think happens in society today when the people at the bottom see the people at the top taking? What's it inspire? Take. And the same goes the other way. It's a vicious cycle. But if you and I will focus on setting the example, we can reverse that cycle. You know, it's really interesting listening to the political debate over the entitlement programs. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, all of the debate is focused on the supply side of the equation. Should we tax more? Should we tax less? Should we tax differently? Enough. You and I can have a profound impact on the demand side of the equation by teaching people give rather than take. And our impact will not be immediate. It's going to take some time. But if you and I are willing to step out and provide the example, we will change things in this country. And then lastly, when you and I are willing to serve, it has a way of clearing the noise out of our heads and our hearts like nothing else. I think back, my wife and I had the opportunity to help a widow about 20 miles from here a couple of months ago. I remember it was a Saturday morning. We decided to get together with a small group from our church. She was a lady who had lost her husband several years back and had recently taken ill, and the property had just gotten out of control. And I remember the drive to the lady's house very, very well. And I don't know if it's because we woke up earlier than we were used to on a Saturday morning or not, but it wasn't that pleasant a ride to the lady's house. I used the opportunity to point out a few of the areas where my wife wasn't meeting my expectations. And unfortunately, her list was longer. And for those of you who are married, you know exactly how ugly these conversations can get. But then we arrived at the lady's house, and we had to paint our smiles on, and we busted our butts for the next 8 hours. We cut grass, we weed eated, we cleaned gutters, we cleared brush till the cows came home. And at the end of the day, I'll never forget the look of appreciation on the lady's face, and the property looked fantastic. But you know what I remember more? Is how different the ride home was. All those problems that we thought we had that morning, they all seemed so small. Dare I say, we actually appreciated one another. When you and I are willing to serve, it brings a level of fulfillment that you just can't find anywhere else. And you know, here's the biggest risk that the group of people in this crowd have today in being the ones who are going to lead the change. We have gotten very good at building safe and comfortable lives for ourselves, haven't we? I think about my own walk. I live 3 miles from the office. I get up in my safe neighborhood. I drive the 3 miles to work. I end up having lunch at the same places with the same people. I finish my day. Then I head back home to my safe neighborhood. If I am going to be unwilling to divert from my path, I will not be part of leading this country to a better place. I read a story recently about a young lady in Chicago who I believe provides an exceptional example. She's a makeup artist. She's very good at what she does. She is so good, in fact, that there are certain celebrities that seek her out when they come through town. As she began her career and she saw her client list growing, as she saw her checkbook balance growing, she also felt the hole right here growing just as big. So one day she made a very bold and courageous decision to change that. She carved one night out of her week where instead of going to have drinks with her friends, she goes to the strip clubs in and around the Chicago area. She sits in the back and she does makeup for the ladies. She's obviously not doing it to make them look better for their patrons. She's doing it because it gives her the ability to speak into their lives. And her impact was not immediate. But over the course of time, she has seen more women leave the profession than she ever dreamed imaginable. Now, fellas, I'm not going to suggest then we wrap up today's meeting that we head and seek to serve in that way. But all joking aside, each of us has been blessed with special skills. We need to find ways to use those special skills to help other people. And looking around the audience, some of you are a little bit older than I am. You've been watching our country drift in this direction longer than I have. And others of you who are younger have maybe taken in a little bit too much TV news over the years. You may have even gotten to the point to where you believe nothing good can come from this country anymore. Before I wrap up, I want to share a personal story with you about a guy who people felt the same way about. This is Joe Sr., my dad. He was born on the 4th of July, 1949, to a poor family in New Orleans. But being poor was the least of his problems. He had a dad who liked to beat his wife, beat his kids in ways that would get you thrown in jail today. When Dad was 7 or 8, he said he found a place under his house where the cinder blocks came together in just the right way that if he tucked himself in, his dad couldn't hit him with rocks. It was a very difficult existence. So he looked for his first escape. Unfortunately for a poor boy from New Orleans, his first escape was to the jungles of Vietnam. Dad entered Nam in February 1968, and war was anything but a graceful experience for him. He saw a lot of killing. He did a lot of killing. And for those of us who haven't been soldiers, we can't quite understand. He did some things when he was there that he can't take back. His first week in Nam, he jumped on a truck with some Marines and they were heading towards a Vietnamese village. He could see in the distance, amidst the fog, Vietnamese children, emaciated, as skinny as can be, covered with dirt from head to toe, walking from their huts towards the roadway. As they approached the children, my dad could see the soldiers pulling out of their pockets what he could identify as their food scraps. When they got to the kids, my dad was horrified when the soldiers began firing the food at the kids as hard as they could. Some of the kids got hit in the head. Most knew it was coming, so they took it off the back. He said there was a little girl who got pelted directly in the eye, and she fell to the ground in a heap. And as she's sitting there screaming and crying on the ground, she's reaching around for what was likely going to be her only meal that day. As they headed out of the village, the soldier next to my dad, a more experienced soldier, could see the disgust in my dad's face, and he said, "You judge me now, but you'll be doing the same thing in a week." Dad had to confess that despite the fact that he was abused as a kid, it didn't take him a week. Things only got much, much uglier from there. Dad left the jungles of Vietnam in February 1969, returned to the States, married my mom a month later. Unbeknownst to her, she had married a very broken man, a man full of hate, anger, rage, grief, shame. You name the negative emotion, he had it. He chose to anesthetize the pain with alcohol. Every day after work, he would head to the local bar, drink till they'd make him leave. How he drove home to this day over the thousands of nights, I have absolutely no clue. But he'd make it home. We'd have to help him in because he could never get his key to the door. We'd walk him to the bed, and he'd repeat the same process the next day. And then in 1985, the best bad thing that ever happened to him. He was a butcher, and he was attempting to transfer a pork loin box from the cart to the cutting table when he twisted wrong and ruptured 2 discs in his lower back. Surgery soon followed, and it came complete with 6 weeks of bed rest. Now, if you think daytime TV is bad today, trust me, it was even worse in the 1980s. So he got bored. So bored, in fact, that he was willing to pick up a book that a friend had dropped by the day of the surgery. Over his remaining time in bed, Dad would read completely through the New Testament. When it was time for him to get out of bed, he was a different man. Some of the signs were very obvious. He would never drink, never smoke for the rest of his life. But what was more compelling was how he chose to spend his time. Instead of heading to the bars, he would head to the VA Center in downtown New Orleans, where he would counsel veterans who were battling some of the same demons he was battling. Dad never became a perfect person, but he did transform his life by shifting his focus away from him and onto other people. Don't let anybody tell you that we can't change this country, because this country is no more than a collection of human beings, and I'm telling you, I've seen it with my eyes. Human beings are capable of incredible change. And you know, all that said, I don't have to look any further into my daughter's eyes to know that this place is still worth saving. But this much I promise you, the answers to what ail us do not reside in Washington, D.C. They don't reside in the state capitol. But what if? What if the movement that was destined to lead this country to its best started in this room today? Are you willing to redefine success away from things for you and onto helping other people? Are you willing to unite rather than divide? Are you willing to lead the change?